Hey, good afternoon to you. 506 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up, Andrew Arthur talks to us from the Center for Immigration Studies, a closer look at Joe Biden's latest border scam ahead of the election. He swears he's getting it under control this time. Is he? Is he? You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Okay, so I've been out for the last week and a half, but in the meantime, of course, the left has cooked up a bunch of new fake scandals. One of them involves Congressman Byron Donalds, who apparently said at he was at an event in Philadelphia, a Black Republican outreach event in Philadelphia, and he was talking about the state of Black Americans throughout history, including during the Jim Crow era. And this is not like some sort of fiction. Black families were more whole during the Jim Crow era, despite all of the things being thrown at Black Americans at the time. Black families were more together. That's just true. There were more fathers and mothers together with children during that era. And after that, there has been a very big devastation of the Black family over time, much of it directly at the hands of the government, which has just been awful. And so Byron Donalds was talking about this reality, and the left has distorted it into something unrecognizable. Even Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat leader, took to the floor of the House to condemn Byron Donalds, and he said this.
It's come to my attention that a so-called leader has made the factually inaccurate statement that Black folks were better off during Jim Crow. That's an outlandish, outrageous, and out-of-pocket observation.
He didn't even say that, though. You're attacking him for something he didn't say. Meanwhile, Joy Reid over on MSNBC, or is this on The View that this occurred? It was MSNBC? So Joy Reid over on MSNBC asked Byron Donalds about all of this, and here's how he responded.
If a Black man, a Black father, could not protect his wife, his son, or himself from lynching and violence, how is him being in the home mean that that is an era that was better for the Black family, or that we should think of as a good thing?
First of all, Joy, I never said that it was better for Black people in Jim Crow. I have never said that, and even my own words say that. If you're talking about the importance of Black fathers in the home, or frankly, all fathers in the home, it is always for the betterment of children, to have leadership, yes, for safety. So having two people in the home to help provide the economic needs for those children.
This is common sense, but the left, of course, has distorted it beyond recognition. Delano Squires joins us now. He's a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and he's on the phone. Hello, sir. Good to have you back with us.
Thanks for having me.
This is one of those bizarro world news cycles that we've become accustomed to, where you get a Republican who says something, the left pretends he said something completely different, and then attacks the thing he didn't say.
I mean, we've seen this. There's a precedent for this. We saw this with the fake, quote-unquote, don't say gay bill in Florida, and how, a bill promoting parental rights in education, which eventually became law, was spun as something that was, against the LGBTQ community, so to speak. And then we saw the same thing happen again in Florida with what I dubbed the don't say slave fake controversy, where two lines in a curriculum that the governor did not write that had to do with slavery were spun out to, and people were saying, well, Governor DeSantis says that slavery was good for Black people, and it was basically a nice jobs program for the Black community. And I think we're back with the same thing, where Byron Donalds says during Jim Crow, the Black family was together. And that was spun as, oh, he thinks Jim Crow was good for Black families. And the frustration part of it, honestly, is that the left has no problem invoking Jim Crow, but only when the purpose is to scare Black voters in 2024 into thinking that they're only one step from going back to 1944. But when a Republican mentions Jim Crow and highlights the resilience of Black families during that time,
yes,
then they said, well, we can't have that. And I think we're seeing this in this, this ginned up fake controversy.
Of course. And one of the many ironies baked into this is that you have a Black Republican talking about the horrors of Jim Crow and Black Americans prevailing in the face of that. And the left nowadays saying, oh, we're against Jim Crow. The left, they own the legacy of Jim Crow. Like the party, even so far as you're going to talk about the history of this, it was the Democrats who advanced all of this. And yet we are in this It's a constant attempt to manipulate what people are hearing to distort it beyond recognition.
Yeah, and it's funny. I've seen this happen so often on social media, and in fact, I've seen it happen to me that I've come up with a way to sort of shed some light to it. What I say is that a lot of people have, and you see this with Joy Reid and other people who are putting words in Byron Donalds' mouth that he never said.
Yeah.
I say that they have degrees from Cleo Keller University. So if you remember Miss Cleo,
yes.
she claimed to be, a medium, that she could read people's minds.
That's right. Call me now for your free reading.
Exactly. and the reference to Keller is Helen Keller. So there are people who can't see what you write and can't hear what you say, but somehow can interpret words that have never left your lips.
Yes.
And this happens all the time. And I think Byron Donalds is just the latest victim. But this is the left native tongue is Lyonese, and this is what they do. They take one clip, and then they will put words in your mouth that you didn't say, and then they will try to spend the rest of the time bashing you because most people don't read past the headline.
Right.
And they'll say, "Oh, Byron Donalds says that Jim Crow was good for black folks," and obviously that's an obvious lie.
And I'm glad you brought up the DeSantis thing too, because that curriculum was actually consistent with the AP curriculum in the first place on African American studies, and the concept was that slaves used some of the skills from their enslavement in order to make money for themselves after they were free. Which is an uncontroversial point and historically true. If you go and look at Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery, he explicitly talks about this detail. And he says, in fact, that many black Americans were in a better position to generate some income for themselves than white Americans who now no longer had slaves in the South. In fact, those whites were so helpless, they had no idea how to function without the labor around them anymore, the slaves that they had before. So it's an actual part of history. The left's position is we shouldn't teach it, and then they come along and they suggest that the right is trying to stop you from knowing about history.
Correct. And this is why, for me personally, and I learned this a long time ago, I don't let people who lie with such frequency shame me or lecture me on particularly when it comes to race and history. Because, again, these are folks who I've seen, whether it's Al Sharpton or other people, other Democrats, they will talk about not just Jim Crow, James Crow Esquire, Jimmy Crow, Jane Crow, Jim Eagle, and it's always the same point. It is a scare tactic meant to emotionally manipulate black voters into doing or supporting whatever leftist policy is up on deck. And the president did this a couple of years back when Georgia was going to change their voting laws, and he mentioned and he said this makes Jim Crow. This is Jim Eagle, right? So this is what they do. Now, what they don't want to do is address the substance of these claims. And again, what Byron Donalds said was absolutely correct. From 1890 through the 1950s, black men and women got married at younger ages and were more likely to be married by the age of 35 than their white counterparts. And the majority, even in 1965, when the Moynihan Report was written and a 1 in 4 out of wedlock birth rate was considered a national emergency, that still tells you that the majority of black children were born to married parents and lived with two married parents. Today, unfortunately, 70% of black children are born out of wedlock and 45% live with a single mother. Now, if somebody wants to say that is a sign of progress because an expansion of government social welfare programs can do what fathers were typically responsible for doing, I would just like them to make that argument flat-footed instead of trying to slam the congressman for something he didn't say.
He also pointed to Great Society initiatives by LBJ and the government's role in all of this. Having looked at this in your career, Delano Squires, how convinced are you that the government has had a massive hand in destroying the black family?
Well, I certainly think it's had a significant hand. Now, I'm the type of person that believes in agency and responsibility. So at times I get uncomfortable with pushing it all off and saying, well, this is all caused by government programs. Because if that's the case, then the natural solution is to say, well, this will all be fixed by government programs. And I do not think that that's the case. But what the government did was create a set of powerful incentives that encourage unwed mothers to not marry the fathers of their children. and it allowed a scenario in which, a woman who didn't have a husband could still be supported financially. Now, instead of, the man who gave her the child, now it was Uncle Sam. And since then, we've been practicing, political polyamory for the last 60 plus years, not just with black women, certainly, but certainly concentrated in some neighborhoods in that particular demographic. So I think the incentive structure in the 1960s that said, we want to make it so that a woman does not need a husband in order to provide for her and her children was one of the worst policy decisions ever made in this country. And in fact, the only ethnic group below that Moynihan threshold, right, 25% out of wedlock birth rate today are Asian Americans. Whites are at about 28%, Hispanics are a little over 50%, and as I said, black Americans are at 70%. So this is a universal problem.
Yes.
And I think it's one that should receive universal attention, particularly as we are coming up on Father's Day.
Yeah, that's critical. All right, let's look at the numbers for all demographics now, because there's a survey out of Pew this week, and they asked how much of a priority should marriage and children be. They asked Americans. Roughly 4 in 10 registered voters say society is better off if people make marriage and having children a priority. That's a minority of respondents, by the way, 40%. Mm-hmm. While a majority say society is just as well off if people have priorities other than family and children. Trump supporters, 59%, are much more likely than Biden supporters at 19% to say that it's better if people prioritize marriage and children. So that's a massive discrepancy. Trump supporters are much more likely to say families are important. Biden supporters, just a fifth of them think that. Why is that?
Well, I think this is, in some respects, a war of worldviews. People often say that politics is downstream from culture, and I think that there's a lot to be said for that. But culture is downstream from worldview, which ultimately means, in many respects, culture is downstream from religion. And as we've become less and less religious, we've gotten further and further away both from the definitions of marriage, right? The design for marriage. People don't even acknowledge that only women can get pregnant anymore. So we have changed significantly as a culture, and I think the sort of deconstructionist model that has accompanied all of the radical movements since the 60s, feminism, particularly with its push for abortion, wanting to sever sex from reproduction, and certainly, the feminists who are anti-marriage wanting to sever women from their homes. That has had an effect, and I think over 6 decades we're starting to see that fruit.
Well, one of the effects is it affects how long your view is, right, on the country. So if you have children or grandchildren, you have to take the long view. You think to yourself, what can I do to ensure that the country is good for them, that I can hand them something better than I had? But if your view is that children need to be excluded from your life, that they're an inconvenience, that they shouldn't be a priority, well, you're living for the now. You have very little incentive to care that much about the future.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've started to write about and speak about more is the fact that the sort of Andrew Tate style alpha male Chad influencer online is really a mirror image of the pink-haired gender studies radical feminists on the left, because both of them say the same thing. They say marriage and children are a bad deal. They say, put all of your energy into your own educational and economic pursuits. They say consume everything you have now and in this generation. And to me, both of them push an anti-family and anti-marriage and anti-natalist position. And I think this is why both conservatives and moderate, sane liberals need to be able to push back on that and say no. Like we want to be able to hand off prosperity to our posterity. And people who say that children and marriage are not high priorities will never be able to do that. And it is a frustration, even going back to the Byron Donalds conversation, particularly around the black family. So many of the people who spend, significant amount of time talking about generational wealth and how, the black community needs to generate and pass on generational wealth. support politics that destroy future generations.
Exactly.
Right. So you can't, on one hand, talk about building generational wealth when you're not building families, and you're certainly not building intact families, and or when you're pushing abortion at every turn. And this is what the left does, particularly as it relates to the black community.
Such a smart point, and another huge incoherent claim by the left. Delano Squires, thank you very much, as always. I always am grateful for our conversations. I learn a lot, so thank you very much. Good to talk to you today, sir. Scott is calling in from Castleton, line 2. Scott, good afternoon. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show. Hello, sir.
Hey, Vince. Thanks for taking my call. Welcome back, bro, man. We missed you so much.
Oh, thanks, brother. Thank you very much.
So I'm single. I've never had a kid. 59 years old, and always been kind of a wild child. My jobs are always kind of dangerous, and I've had girlfriends my whole life, but it was just never anything, that I did. I mean, maybe if I found the right lady, I would have settled down. My life would be different. But you're spot on when you say that, it's day to day. But if you have a family, it's more of a lifetime. You've invested more in the culture. And I agree with you that the destruction of the nuclear family is really making our culture suffer these days. And
it's not to say that
I was part of it, but
yeah. And look, it's not to say that people aren't going to end up single. People do. It's just, but as a society, if you want to thrive, the more people who can take the long view, the better. Also, speaking from my own experience, becoming a parent renewed my sense of faith too, because if you're going to have to construct a moral understanding for a child, it's going to be really important for you to get your own bearings first. And that definitely helped me. And I think on a society-wide level, it's a good thing, which is why we should really cherish families, even if we're not all, part of creating one. That's totally fine. It's 529. Hey, good afternoon to you. It's 5:36 here. News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. You can join us, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. This past week, Joe Biden, the White House, announced a crackdown on the border. They're finally going to get that thing under control, but the New York Post is calling it BS. It's a BS border move. They say it's already failed. Thursday saw some 10,000 migrants in Border Patrol custody, 4 times the limit at which the president said he would stop processing the phony asylum claims used by so many illegals. For more on what actually happened this past week, I want to bring in the expert on the subject. Andrew Arthur is here. He's a resident fellow in law and policy for the Center for Immigration Studies and a former immigration judge, so he knows it all, and he joins us now. Andrew, great to have you back with us, sir.
Vince, thanks so much for having us.
This is so the White House every so often is coming out with a new announcement that, this time we're really going to get the border under control. What does this one amount to?
Quite frankly, I wholeheartedly concur with the New York Post. Now, if you look at it at face value, it is a promise by the President of the United States to cut off entries across the southwest border whenever illegal entries exceed 2,500 per day over a 7-day period. If you actually read all the way through the proclamation and the fact sheet and the rule that was submitted with this, what it really comes down to is we're going to make it slightly harder for people to receive asylum in 10 years when their hearings eventually roll around, but we're going to continue to release people into the United States. And to prove that point, Bill Malugin over at Fox News tweeted out a leaked memo from the San Diego sector of the Border Patrol, and it indicated that the vast majority of migrants who come to the United States illegally are going to continue to be released in the United States. They're not going to be detained as the law says they're supposed to be. We're not even going to ask for a bond for them. We're simply going to release them on their own recognizance. So this truly is a political act. It's smoke and mirrors. It's going to get people, a little excited, but it's not going to make one whit of difference.
So if we see illegal crossings rise to above 2,500 a day for an entire week, it doesn't mean that the Biden administration is going to shut down the border. They just claim that they're going to gum up the asylum process a little bit more.
Yeah, they're going to make it slightly harder for individuals, for those migrants that come here illegally, to eventually be granted asylum. but they're not actually going to not release them into the United States. They're not going to actually impose any restrictions. They're probably not going to deport that many people. Now, there are exceptions under the memo that Mnuchin tweeted out. Mexicans are going to be voluntarily returned. And to explain that, Vince, if you get voluntarily returned, you haven't been ordered removed. And, we played this game with Mexican illegal border crossers for decades. We send them back, they come back in.
What does that, but what does voluntarily return mean? That's like, hey, you crossed illegally. Would you like to go back? Your choice.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. In fact, when I was a trial attorney with the INS, I think the most voluntary returns I ever saw on any individual was 48. Some guy who was apprehended 48 times coming illegally to the United States, and we dutifully sent him back across the border to Mexico. So, yeah, I mean, and that more or less is the game. And for those Mexican nationals, they take voluntary return, they get sent back, and then the next time they're just extra careful about not getting caught entering the United States illegally. It doesn't mean that they're not going to come or that anything's really going to happen to them. They're not going to be prosecuted if they re-enter after being voluntarily returned. So, yeah, I mean, that's how that's going to work. Now, Mexico has also agreed to take up to 30,000 Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans every month. So, those folks are either going to be interviewed to see whether they have a asylum claim, or they're going to be allowed to withdraw their applications for admission. And that's pretty much just like voluntary return. When you withdraw your application for admission, you go back across the border and you get in line. Either to re-enter illegally or to get one of those CBP-1 interview slots, which is like open table for illegal entries. For
sure. So the one of the things that Bill Mnuchin showed today in the memo that you just referenced is that you've got a lot of the people who are crossing illegally, at least into the San Diego sector, include Chinese, Middle Eastern, and African adults. So you mentioned some of these, Central American countries. That's not even really who's primarily coming across the border in the San Diego sector, apparently. Chinese, Middle Eastern, and African adults, and they're all being released into the United States with future court dates. They're just still being released. So that the status on this hasn't changed at all, has it?
No, it literally hasn't. In fact, I did an analysis a couple of weeks ago in which I noted the fact that in 2024, nearly half of all the people encountered by CBP at the southwest border don't even come from North America. They don't come from Central America. They don't come from Mexico. They come from either South America or beyond, including significant numbers of Chinese nationals and significant numbers of Russians. And the reason that San Diego gets so many of those folks is because Tijuana International Airport is literally right across the line from San Diego sector. And so, people from that country fly into Tijuana, they grab their bags, and they dutifully head to the U.S. border where this kabuki theater takes place, where Border Patrol agents go and round them up, type a bunch of stuff into a computer, and then release them in the United States for their court appearance, which, will eventually end probably around 2040.
So when it was just Mexican nationals crossing in that region of the border, it used to be, as I understand it, that Border Patrol agents could just take a Mexican national, bring them up to a literal door in the border, open it, shove them through, and then close it. They send them back to Mexico. But when you've got people coming from places like China and the Middle East and Africa, DHS is apparently telling reporters in a background call that they can't even send them anywhere because these countries are refusing to take their own citizens back?
Yeah, no, and we refer to those as recalcitrant countries. And you probably remember that the Trump administration attempted to crack down on recalcitrant countries. And this is a pretty easy game to play. If they won't take back their nationals, then what we do is we either stop issuing visas in their country, or more commonly, we don't give visas to the family members of the people that actually run the country. We do that for a couple of weeks, and then all of a sudden the passports start showing up. But we never did that with China. We do it on a limited level with, some smaller countries. But if we were to stop this visa issuance at Shanghai tomorrow, and say we're not going to, reopen it until you start sending us passports, that consulate would be probably closed for about 8 hours before we received more PRC passports than we knew what to do with.
So what has the Biden administration's tact been with these countries, to the extent that they care about actually deporting anybody here? Are they just begging these countries, hey, would you please, please, please take back your Chinese nationals?
Yeah, I don't even think they're doing that much. Plainly, for people that are under final orders of removal, assuming that they fit within Alejandro Mayorkas's priorities, which are, pretty limited. But assuming that they do, then we go to, the home country and we ask them to send the passport, and eventually maybe they do and maybe they don't. But, unlike Trump and, even Obama and Bush before Biden doesn't, threaten to, stop visa issuance or stop accepting nationals from those countries. They don't do it at all. And again, that sort of underscores the lack of seriousness with which President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, and numerous others in this administration, treat this issue.
At the core of the way the Biden administration is posturing itself, they're seeming to suggest that there's so many people all around the planet who are entitled to asylum in the United States. In your view, how many people are actually eligible? Like, it used to be, I thought that it was a pretty narrow category, and I thought that you had to really kind of be contiguous to the United States. You had to share a border with us to make us the first place you claimed asylum.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Vince, because one of the things that you'll hear is, well, international law requires us to allow people from all over the planet to, enter illegally and apply for asylum. International law only requires us to accept back people who are going to be tortured in their home countries. And that's actually a very narrow definition. It's not everything that you would think of as torture, or alternatively, who are coming directly from the country of persecution. So in the case of the United States, that would be Canadians and Mexicans, maybe a handful of Bahamians too. But, instead, the Biden administration has created this scenario where every human being who enters this country illegally from a foreign country who says the word asylum has a constitutional right to apply for it, which is not what the law says at all.
No, and my impression is that everybody who's crossing our border is destroying documents that demonstrate their actual identity, or they're at least throwing them on the ground before they cross. Is that true?
Yeah, no. In fact, there are many litter problems that are associated with this particular, disaster that's going on there. But one of them is the fact that if you go to the banks of the Rio Grande River, you'll find piles and piles of identity documents, including documents that show that individual migrants were firmly resettled in a third country. So you'll see a lot of Peruvian green cards for Venezuelan nationals, because, of course, they don't want to tell anybody that they've been living in Peru for the last 10 years. No, they've come directly to this country, fleeing the Maduro, campaign of violence against political opponents. But that is a fact of life. In fact, every now and again, I, would go and gather them up, but it just became so common it wasn't even worth doing it anymore.
Yeah, and so in addition to illegally crossing into the United States, one of their first acts is to perpetrate a fraud on the American people when they make claims that are not true about their need for asylum, in light of the fact that, as you point out, they've already been granted asylum in other safe third countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, if DHS had any integrity whatsoever under the current administration, they would gather up those documents and match the people who they belong to people who are applying for asylum. They don't even do that. I mean, it truly is just garbage, up there with the socks and pants that are discarded at the southwest border. So, yeah, I mean, it's a fraud. They know it's a fraud, and they don't do anything about it.
I think I saw in your writing as well, and we're talking with Andrew Arthur from the Center for Immigration Studies, I think I saw in your assessment, too, that under the loose definitions of who gets to stay in the United States, that just by virtue of the fact that the cartels handle the travel of so many of these illegals into the United States, that they can therefore make a claim that they're being handled by bad people, so therefore they're entitled to asylum in America?
Yeah, and that's actually a fairly common claim. People will argue that, Sinaloa or the Gulf Cartel or the Jalisco New Generation Cartel is the de facto government of Mexico, at least in parts of it. And therefore, the threats that the cartels have made against them are threats made by the legitimate government, and their opposition to what the cartels want is political opinion. It's persecution on account of political opinion for when the cartels come after them for that. That's a pretty common claim. Gang recruitment claims from Central America, MS-13 or 18th Street Gang. People will make those exact same claims, or alternatively, they'll claim that they're a member of a particular social group and then cobble together a bunch of clauses that are more or less specific to just a very narrow group of individuals. And, the Biden administration reversed policies that Jeff Sessions in particular, Donald Trump's first attorney general, implemented to say, no, those are, that's common criminality. You don't fear persecution. What you fear is crime. And it's axiomatic in immigration law and has been for 40 years that, fear of crime is not persecution for purposes of asylum relief.
All right. Andrew Arthur from the Center for Immigration Studies, always taking a deep dive on such important issues. Thank you, sir, very much for cutting through that for us today.
Vince, thanks so much for having me.
It's always nice to chat with you. That's Andrew Arthur. All right. Hold on. I got more in a moment, including some audio here from Texas Governor Greg Abbott. Get his reaction to what's going on at the border. Spoiler, it's terrible. All right, I'm going to skip the Greg Abbott audio. Greg Abbott basically says it's still crap on the border. He told Fox News this weekend, just in case you were wondering. Because I want to get to this. The head coach of the Boston Celtics, who, by the way, are up 2-0 over the Dallas Mavericks right now in the NBA Finals, a guy called Joe Mazzulla, he was asked about this idea that there are 2 black coaches in the NBA Finals right now. He's done with all this leftist garbage. Take a listen to this.
Hey, Joe. Vince Gould, Yahoo Sports. For the first time since 1975, this is the NBA Finals where you have 2 black head coaches. Given the plight sometimes of black head coaches in the NBA, do you think this is a significant moment? Do you take pride in this? How do you view this, or do you not see it at all?
I wonder how many of those have been Christian coaches.
Pause.
David Aldridge?
They call on next question. Because he was just like, hey, how many have been Christian coaches? Why are we obsessing over being black? Finally, again, this goes to the point that I was making earlier in the show, and we make so often here. I do think more people are finding their spines. We're getting more fight. People are like, I'm not playing these stupid games anymore. I'm not playing these stupid games. Meanwhile, in basketball, one of the big news items this week, Caitlin Clark has been left off of the Olympic team because the left is insane. That's really what this is about. They resent Caitlin. They don't want her to be on the Olympic team. She'd help them win another gold, and she's already bringing a lot of popularity to women's basketball. She's been gracious about being left off the team.
Caitlin, what was your reaction when you saw the USA team yesterday, the roster come out?
Yeah, I think I'm excited for the girls that are on the team. I know it's the most competitive team in the world, and I know it could have gone either way of me being on the team, me not being on the team. So, I'm excited for them. I'm going to be rooting them on to win gold. I was a kid that grew up watching the Olympics, so it'll be fun to watch them.
What was your level of disappointment not hearing your name on the roster?
Honestly, no disappointment. I think it just gives you something to work for. It's a dream. Hopefully one day I can be there, and I think it's just a little more motivation. You remember that, and hopefully in 4 years, when 4 years comes back around, I can be there.
Well, that's classy. You remember when athletes all used to be more classy? Gracious. It's for the team. I wish them all the best. It's nice. Nicer to them that they're being to her, that's for sure. Hey, up next, the great one himself, Mark Levin, right here on WMAL.